up, y'all? It's your hometown hero, the real Adam Coleman here at Tru-ID Apologetics. And I'm just dropping this video, man. Last week I had the pleasure of doing a live session with Epiphany Fellowship up there in Philly, man, hosted by my man, J.C. Jones. Shout out to him. Shout out to Pastor Eric Mason for having me on. So actually I did a live session addressing the problem of evil, where we kind of worked our way through different ways to engage the problem of evil and converse with people about it and so forth. This is a part of a broader series that Epiphany Fellowship is putting on regarding urban apologetics, and I'm honored to be a part of it. So I was able to get the video from that, and I wanted to make sure that I share it with my folks here in YouTube land on my channel. So I'm dropping this video for y'all, and I expect more to come, man. Actually, on June 27th, I'll be doing another session dealing with atheism in the African-American context. So you definitely want to check that out. That'll be on Facebook, on Epiphany Fellowship's page, and I think they'll probably be posting it to YouTube as well. But of course, I'm gonna have it coming to y'all too. So anyway, I hope y'all enjoyed this video, man. And I'd like to hear your feedback from it. Hit me up right here in the chat, man, and I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts, yo. All right, love y'all, man. Peace.
Good morning, and we are live here at Epiphany Fellowship, and we're going to give some time for people to come on the Facebook Live video here. Go ahead and come on in and get settled in. Hope you all are ready for just a great interactive training session. Excited about this this morning. This is going to be just a great session this morning. All right, so
don't oversell it, man, because if I'm messing up, man, I disappoint people, bro.
Oh man, I think you're going to give them way more than what they expected from what I know about you, brother.
Okay.
All right, family. So good morning to you. I think we got a good amount in the room with us to go ahead and get started. Please do share the video. And this is just going to be a dynamic and interactive training session on the problem of evil and suffering. My name is J.C. Jones, and I have Adam Coleman with me. In a moment, I'm going to let him introduce himself, but just wanted to say a couple things. We're bringing this to you live this morning. This is the Surge Evangelism Ministry here at Epiphany Fellowship Church, and Surge is the new name of our evangelism ministry. It's an acronym. It stands for Sent for Urban Relevant Gospel Engagement. And so I will be unpacking that, or we will be unpacking that more as far as what our team, the evangelism ministry, is about over the next few months. But suffice it to say that at the heart of what we do is evangelism, apologetics, and different mercy and justice type outreaches and things like that. And so what we wanted to do as a ministry is actually offer some urban apologetics training sessions to you all as just everyday believers, so that you can be more equipped to answer some of the common questions and objections that people have about the Christian faith as you're seeking to do evangelism. And we think that both go together, evangelism and apologetics. As you try to tell people about Jesus Christ and the gospel, then people are going to have questions about the Christian faith and things like that. They may have objections, and we need to be able to answer those things. And so that's where the apologetics comes in. And so both go together. And so we want to offer you this urban apologetics training series. Over the next few months, we're going to be answering some of the common questions and objections about the Christian faith. Today, we're starting with the problem of evil and suffering, and we're going to really zoom lens on just the angle coming from the African-American experience. And so just nuance it a bit there. So we want to focus in on that this morning, because in light of the times, there are a lot of people suffering. There's a lot of evil and injustice going on in the world. And you got a lot of people asking a lot of questions right now. I was just sharing with Adam that I've done a few funerals over the last 4 weeks and sitting with people that are wondering, why did God allow this to happen to my loved one? People wondering why the police brutality, why is God allowing certain things? So anyway, we got Adam Coleman with us here in the building to help us walk through that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let him introduce himself. and then he'll flip it back to me. I got a couple more things, ground rules I want to lay for this session, and then Adam will start presenting. So Adam, brother, glad to have you with us, man. Please go ahead and just introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then also what sparked the passion and the fire that you have for Urban Apologetics.
Yeah, man. First of all, I just want to say, thank you for bringing me in, man. Definitely want to give a shout out to Pastor Mason. Much respect for him, to him and Epiphany Fellowship for bringing me. I'm really glad to be here. If anything, because it gave me a reason to actually, get a shape up. You know what I'm saying? I've been looking kind of rough these last couple of months with the pandemic. You know what I mean? So, try to shape up the beard a little bit. I would have been in here looking like the problem of evil. Not for having the cause to get it tight. But anyway, happy to be here, man. This actually is a subject that I really am passionate about. I don't often tell this story, but actually the reason why I'm doing apologetics now has a lot to do with the problem of evil. I'm not going to tell the whole story, but just a long story short, if you will. Years ago, I guess it's been about 8 or 9 years ago now, I was newly married. Been married for about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years. Things were just, clicking on all cylinders, man. I had just got a new job, was making more money. Wasn't broke, was excited about that. Just bought a new home and ministry was popping, all kind of stuff. And long story short, my wife, we found out that she was pregnant, so of course we were excited about that as well. As a matter of fact, I found out that she was pregnant about a week or two before I was scheduled to go on a missions trip to Jamaica. So, I'm all excited about that. Go to Jamaica, man. People are giving their lives to the Lord and all that kind of stuff. Just had a blessed time. Came back, so I'm hyped, man. At the time I was doing gospel rap, so things was popping with that as well. So everything was cool. Just bought a new home and all that. Unfortunately, about a week after returning from Jamaica, we found out that my wife had a miscarriage. Which is like just way out of left field. We were devastated. And we were asking some of the same questions that you just mentioned, like, God, why? We felt like, hey, we did things the right way when we got married, and we're living as best we can. We're tithing and all that. You know what I'm saying? Preaching and everything. How could this happen? So we were devastated. It was definitely one of the hardest times of my life. At that time, the hardest time of my life. But interestingly enough, by God's providence, about 5 months before then. My dad, who's passed on now, but about 5 months before then, my dad had sent me some apologetics books. And I'd been introduced to apologetics sometime a little bit before then. But for whatever reason, when he sent me these books, the light bulb kind of just cut on for me. And I was just really just eating it up. Every day I was studying apologetics, just reading through these books, not realizing that I was building up my faith so that when we encountered this tragedy, I was able to navigate through it. As a matter of fact, actually, I got one of the books right here. This is On Guard by William Lane Craig. This is one of the books that my dad sent me. And, he talks about the problem of evil in here. And so it, just kind of building my faith and reasoning through things, it helped me to navigate through that tragic time, right? If it wasn't for that, by God's grace, I don't know where I would be, to be honest with you. I probably wouldn't be here sitting with y'all right now. But I said that to say that this is why I'm so passionate about apologetics, because for me, this isn't just giving people information or battling people online or whatever. This is personal. Like this is something that helped me as a believer to navigate some of life's most difficult questions. And so, as a matter of fact, interestingly enough, like I said, one of the books that I got was from William Lane Craig. And actually one of the highlights of my, apologetics experience, if you will, is a couple years later. I guess the upside of the story is that my wife, we ended up having some children. We have 4 now, as a matter of fact. We've got 4 kids, so pray for our brother, because it is real in the field. But after we had our 2, I actually got a chance to meet William Lane Craig and have lunch with him and stuff. And he actually has a series of children's books, and I was able to get his autograph. He autographed one of his children's books to my daughter and my son that I had at the time. So it was just like a nice little, kind of happy ending with that. But nevertheless, that's how I really got sparked with apologetics. With that being said, real quick, one thing I did notice as I was listening to apologetics like 5 hours a day at one point, just getting it in. And I was coming across questions and objections to Christianity that are gaining traction in the African-American context that I wasn't hearing, the mainstream apologists address. And so actually, after listening to this one guy who was addressing, the question of is Christianity the white man's religion, this is a white apologist, very well known. And I was listening to him. I'm like, yeah, that's dope, but you might want to deal with this point or deal with that point. So I actually started writing him a letter. I was going to send him an email and say, hey, man, you might want to address these kind of things, right? And I got about 75% of the way through that email, and it just dawned on me. It's like, why don't I do it? Why don't I get off the bench, get in the game, and address these questions? Because as I've been grappling with them, God's been giving me answers, so maybe I can share that with others. And ultimately, that's how it really sparked me to get into urban apologetics. Now, fun fact, a lot of people don't know this. So Ernest Cleo Grant, I know you're familiar with him, right? So around this time, Ernest Cleo Grant wrote an article. I want to say it was on ancient African Christianity, right? And I read that article and I was excited. Like, oh man, somebody else is seeing what I'm seeing. So I contacted him online. And we actually ended up talking about on the phone. I was at my job and just saying, hey man, what do you think I should do to kind of get into this thing? And at the time I was going to write a book, and he was like, man, you might want to start with, building a platform like a podcast or something like that. And so actually out of that conversation, that was one of the things that really pushed me to start the Tru-ID podcast. Now, interesting enough, like years later, maybe actually, I guess it was about a year or so ago, I was telling him, I said, hey, man, it's because of you that I started Tru-ID podcast. He's like, nah, man, whatever, man. I appreciate it, but nah. I was like, nah, for real. Because he had forgotten about that conversation. I reminded him of it. He was like, oh, that was you? I was like, yeah, man, so, we actually partly owe it to Ernest Cleo Grant for the existence of the Tru-ID podcast, man. So shout out to him, man. Shout out to him. So, yeah, that's why I do what I do, brother.
Man, thank you for sharing that, brother. And that's powerful. And we're glad that God just equipped you to be able to engage in these things and appreciate the heart that you bring to it. And as you said, it's not just about the intellectual part of it, but man, these things really touch people in some very deep ways. And so I think you're going to cover more of that in your session. And we want to go ahead and get into the session itself. Don't want to keep people waiting any longer. I'll just say this to our viewing audience, just real quick. So what we're about to do is Adam is going to get ready to start presenting. He'll pull up his slides and start presenting. And what's going to happen is about halfway through his presentation, because we want to make this interactive for you all, about halfway through his presentation, he's going to pause and actually do Q&A for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then continue on for the rest of his presentation, and then actually do another Q&A session at the end as well, just to make this interactive. And so with that said, as he's presenting, if you have questions, go ahead and you can put them in the chat. If you're on Facebook Live, you could put your questions in the chat as he's presenting. And then what I'll do is I will field the questions when we come to the Q&A time, or you can just save them for when we come to the Q&A. Either way, but just want you to know that he's going to be answering questions, because what we want to do is make sure this material is understandable and accessible for you all as just everyday believers. And so want to answer your questions if you need clarity about anything that he's talking about. And so we're going to go ahead and get ready to get started, but just wanted to throw that out there to you all. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it back over to my brother Adam and let him start walking through the presentation. About halfway, we'll start doing a short time of Q&A. So thank you for your attention, and let's get ready for a great session. So Adam, do your thing, brother.
All right, great, man. Appreciate it. So you can see my slides and everything. Everything's looking good, or everything's in shape. Okay, cool. All right. So again, we're tackling a pretty big topic here, right? This is the problem of evil and suffering. Now, mind you, this is a topic that theologians, philosophers have been dealing with literally for centuries, for millennia, actually. So obviously we're not going to be able to cover everything today, but this will give you a solid introduction into the problem of evil. And so just so we're all on the same page in terms of where we're going, we're going to start with defining the problem of evil and suffering. For the most part, you'll hear me kind of shorten that to just refer to it as the problem of evil. But we'll be defining the problem of evil and suffering. We'll lay the groundwork for some key terms that we're going to need. I would advise you to take notes as we go, because it'll help you to kind of keep track of what we're doing. We'll also talk about how to kind of take the pressure off of ourselves when we're engaged in these conversations. We'll engage two of the more prominent versions of the argument, and then we'll briefly address how some of the other worldviews that we come in contact with, whether it be Hebrew Israelism, Islam, and so forth, how they fail to address the problem of evil, and then we're going to engage we're going to address how to engage others who are struggling with the problem of evil, or maybe even yourself, how to kind of navigate these things. Just as a quick caveat, I'm going to be giving some different, basically a range of options that you can use to answer the questions that you come in contact with. And so I recognize that I'm dealing with a crowd that's probably theologically diverse to some extent. And so what I'll try to do is be nuanced at certain points, so I can kind of just let you know that this particular approach is mostly used by such and such theological persuasion, versus others. So I'll try to be nuanced about that. All right. So the first thing I want to start out with real quick is understanding what kind of problem it is that we're dealing with. Okay. When we're dealing with apologetics, a lot of times we get questions like, did Constantine write the Bible in 325 AD at the Council of Nicaea? Obviously the answer is no. That's a historical question. We can provide historical evidence, to show that it isn't the case. Or we could say, does evolution, the theory of evolution, disprove that God exists? Obviously, we can say no. There's a number of different ways scientifically we can engage that, and philosophically we can engage that kind of question to say no, that's not the case, and we can show some scientific evidence to demonstrate why. Right. So those are historical questions. We could say something like, does Jesus come from Horus? That's another one that we might get. Again, that's a historical question, or it might get into digging into primary sources to kind of figure that out. Right. But the question of the problem of evil, like say, why do bad things happen to good people? That's a different kind of question. That's a philosophical question. Right. And so throughout the bulk of what we're doing, we're kind of just in the frame of mind of we're dealing with Christian philosophy. Okay. Basically, I define Christian philosophy as applying the Bible and the biblical worldview to a philosophical question or philosophical issues. Okay. So that's what we're doing here. We're applying the biblical worldview to the philosophical issue of the problem of evil. Okay. Now, the problem of evil is not a new problem. Certainly not a new problem. Right. This right here is a gentleman by the name of Epicurus. He was reported to have lived somewhere between 241 AD and 341 AD and 270. I messed it up. I'm sorry, BC. I always get the AD and BC mixed up. I apologize. So Epicurus lived between 341 BC and 270 BC. Okay. And this is a version of the problem of evil that he posed back in the day. So you can kind of see how far back it goes. I'll just go ahead and read it. He says, is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? If then he's not omnipotent. Is God able? Is he able, but not willing? Then he's malevolent or evil, right? Is he both able and willing? If that's the case, then whence cometh evil? Or that's kind of the King James version, I guess. But where does evil come from? If God is able and willing to get rid of it, is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? Okay, this is kind of like, this really frames what the problem of evil is about. It's about the existence of God, challenging the existence of God, but also challenging the nature of God. It's saying that, okay, well, either this God doesn't exist, or there's something about him that you believe to be the case that isn't the case, i.e. he's all good. He's not all good if there's evil, or he's not all powerful, or something along those lines. That really captures the heart of what people are trying to get at with the overall problem of evil. Okay. So to bring it down to today's terms, to jump out of the King James English here for a second to make it a little more relatable to us today. We're talking about the problem of evil, broadly speaking, in the context of at least doing Christian apologetics, is dealing with this notion that the world contains undesirable states of affairs that provides the basis for an argument that makes it unreasonable to believe that the existence in the existence of God. Okay, and like I said, it also attacks the nature of God as well, like his moral character and so forth. Okay, so basically, what we're talking about is what we need to make clear here. There's a distinction between the problem of evil and arguments from evil. Okay. Now, step back a little bit, even though we're going to be dealing with the problem of evil in context of objection to Christianity, really the problem of evil is something that everybody has to deal with. I'm saying, regardless of what your worldview is, the problem of evil is something that we all have to deal with. There's evil and suffering in the world, right? So whether you're a Christian, whether you're an atheist, Buddhist, Muslim, or whatever, you got to demonstrate how it is that your worldview can address, that problem of evil. So the problem of evil, the very existence of evil and suffering in the world, is something that people of all worldviews have to grapple with and make sense of. Okay, arguments from evil deal with, okay, addressing, basically taking that problem and then making objections to a particular worldview, given the existence of evil and suffering in the world. So there's a difference between the problem of evil, kind of like as an umbrella, and then arguments from evil. All right. Hopefully that makes sense so far. Okay, so let's define some terms real quick. We're going to move relatively quickly because I want to make sure that we're getting into the meat of the arguments here. But broadly speaking, when people are talking about evil, okay, they're talking about that which is immoral, wicked, or contrary to well-being. So think of something like injustice is evil, right? Or racism is evil. It's just kind of these concepts. These things are immoral. They're against someone's well-being. That's what folks are talking about when they're talking about evil. Okay. Now, there's a distinction between evil and suffering, because suffering is more tangible, than evil, in the sense that when you're talking about suffering, you're really talking about the state of the person or thing that's suffering some sort of pain, distress, hardship, and so forth. So experiencing or going through, cancer and cancer recovery, that would be an example of suffering, right? Getting pulled over by the police, for no good reason because you're Black, driving through a white neighborhood. That would be an instance of suffering. You're suffering some sort of hardship or some sort of harm or distress. So again, the concept of suffering is more tangible than evil. I'm saying we're talking about some state of affairs in the world. That's what we're talking about with suffering, right? To kind of draw another distinction, I'm going to move here to the next slide. All right. In the literature, by literature I mean amongst the brainiacs in philosophy, if you will, they draw a distinction between moral evil and natural evil. Okay, that's very important. Moral evil and natural evil. Now, moral evil, you're talking about just people doing bad things. We see that all the time. Obviously, I've got a picture there of George Floyd and Derek Chauvin. That's a perfect example of moral evil. All right, George Floyd was murdered by Derek Chauvin. You have a person doing bad things to another person or thing that can suffer some sort of harm. Okay. So juxtapose that with natural evil, where we're dealing with like hurricanes, floods, things that are not necessarily tied to anybody's intentions, but yet they're bad things that's going on in the world. So I've got a picture of the COVID-19 virus, right? Now, obviously, the virus doesn't have intentions per se. It's not a person that's going around inflicting harm, but nevertheless, it's something in the natural world that's bringing about suffering and so forth. So there's this distinction between moral evil and natural evil. It's very important to kind of keep those two categories in mind. Also, when we're talking about evil, in terms of a deeper story of what we're dealing with here, right? If we step back from it, this whole concept of evil obviously relates to morality, right? Evil is a moral term. So what do people mean? How do people conceptualize the morality, if you will? Generally speaking, you're going to have basically two forms of morality that philosophers are dealing with. You've got subjective morality and you have objective morality. Okay. Subjective morality and objective morality. Now, subjective morality, when I'm using that term, I'm basically referring to that kind of, morality that's dependent upon what somebody thinks about or what stance they take on a moral issue, right? So something is either good, bad, right or wrong, dependent upon what somebody's stance, opinion, or thoughts are on it. That's subjective morality. So to kind of use an example, it would be like if I say that chocolate ice cream is better than cookies and cream ice cream, right? And somebody else says, well, no, I think that cookies and cream ice cream is better. I mean, obviously that's subjective. We're just giving our opinions on what we believe to be the case. Neither one of us, as we're arguing that point, is really right or wrong. It's just a matter of preferences, or our opinions. That's kind of what we're dealing with when we're talking about subjective morality. It's basically somebody's opinion, their thoughts, their stance, on a particular moral issue, right? It's based in the person. All right. Now, on the other side, if we're talking about objective morality, we're talking about something is either good, bad, right, or wrong, independent of what anybody thinks about it, or independent of what anybody's stance is on it. Okay. So just in the same way that 2 + 2 = 4. Murder is wrong. That's what we're talking about when we're saying something about objective morality, right? It's this notion that morality itself is a feature of reality. That morality is a feature of reality itself, independent of what anybody thinks about it. Okay, that's objective morality. It's really important to kind of keep those two categories on point. So, all right. So I think we've laid the groundwork in terms of definitions. I'm hoping I haven't lost anybody, but you want to keep those definitions in mind as we move forward. Okay. Really breaking down what are people talking about when they're discussing this problem of evil. Okay. Now, why is it such a problem? Well, it's ultimately it's a worldview issue. It's a worldview issue. Okay. Now, what do I mean by worldview? So, a worldview is just like it sounds. It's the lens through which you see the world, right? We can imagine it's kind of like, or we can put it this way: it's the sum total of everything you believe to be real or true about the world. That's your worldview. We can use the analogy of like a puzzle, and so each of the puzzle pieces represents something you believe to be true or real, and you put all those puzzle pieces together. The big picture that you get is like that's your worldview. It's your big picture of the world. Okay. Now, as I like to say, not all worldviews are created equal. Okay. Not all worldviews are created equal. And we have ways of assessing whether a worldview has merit or not. Now, some of the criteria for that I put up here on the screen. We kind of just run through them. But as we're assessing whether or not a worldview kind of really stands up, or not, one thing that we can look at is that worldview internally consistent? Meaning, do the puzzle pieces of that worldview fit together well, or do they clash with one another? Okay. So an example of that would be, so I think that's something that we're all familiar with, is when people say that Christianity is the white man's religion, right? What are they really saying about that? Okay. Really what they're saying is, me as an African American person or somebody who's of African descent, basically saying that, hey, my ethnic identity puzzle piece of my worldview doesn't fit well with what I believe to be this European puzzle piece. And so there's a clash between these two puzzle pieces. And so therefore I'm going to get rid of my my Christianity puzzle piece, because given the fact that I'm an African, so because my identity puzzle piece of my worldview is not fitting with my Christianity puzzle piece, right? So that's a example of how people, basically puzzle pieces clashing. Now, obviously, we know that's not the case. I mean, anybody who spent time doing history, shout out to my man Vince Bantu, but I mean, we've already slaughtered that argument. But that's just an example of how people can be mistaken about world puzzle pieces within a worldview clashing. And so, secondly, does your worldview align with reality? Is there evidence that your worldview is true? Or do you believe it just because? What is the evidence, or what is the reason for one's worldview? Does it align with reality? And then thirdly, is that worldview livable? Can you live it out in a consistent way in the world, right? So for example, for anybody who believes that Black Lives Matter, right? I believe that Black Lives Matter too, right? Because we've all been made in the Imago Dei, we're image bearers, and God has endowed mankind with personal value. And so, yes, I can affirm that Black Lives Matter. But if you're an atheist, you say that Black Lives Matter, well, I don't know how you can really live that out if you're an atheist, because really, if there is no God, and we'll get to this in a minute, then nothing matters. Nobody matters, right? So you can't live that out. Obviously, I'm saying when you see people getting gunned down in the street, you can't live that out and say, oh, nobody matters. We just kind of keep it moving. We're all engaged with this moral reality. And so if you have a worldview like atheism where you can't live it out in a consistent way, then that's an indicator that there's something wrong with your worldview. Likewise, if your worldview doesn't align with reality, or if it's not internally consistent, if there's puzzle pieces of your worldview are clashing, those are all red flags then that there's something deficient, or there's something wrong with your worldview, right? Now, when it comes to the problem of evil, the issue is that people are saying that given the existence of suffering and evil in the world, specifically with Christianity or whatever worldview they want to take aim at, they're saying that your worldview, I'll just kind of condense it down to our discussion here. They're saying that the Christian worldview can't account for evil. It's a puzzle piece that doesn't fit within the framework of the biblical worldview. Or they're saying that whatever answer it is that we're offering to the problem of evil, they're saying that it doesn't align with reality. And there's no way that you can navigate the problem of evil from a Christian perspective. And so that's basically what the problem of evil comes down to. They're saying that there's something deficient about the biblical worldview. So what we want to do is give some responses to that and show that that's obviously not the case. Okay. So you've probably already encountered the problem of evil several times, and maybe you may not have been aware of it. But here's some kind of common expressions. Where was Jesus during slavery? That's kind of dealing with the problem of evil. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why did XYZ happen to me? You might be dealing with a person who maybe they were molested or raped or something of that nature, and they might have questions. They might be questioning either the existence of God or the nature of God based upon something that they personally experienced. Or if God is all powerful and all loving, why is there evil and suffering in the world? That's kind of like a broader sense that we see kind of reflected in Epicurus's statement earlier, right? So those are some kind of common expressions of the problem of evil. With that being said, I'm not going to dwell too long on this, but with that being said, I do believe that for people of African descent, particularly here in the West, I would argue that the problem of evil occupies a unique place in our history here in America, in the Western world. Okay. Let me move forward here so I can kind of really break down what I mean by that. Okay. I believe that the problem of evil occupies a unique place in our history here in America. Now, I really want to stress here real quick. You cannot do urban apologetics effectively without dealing with the intersection between the problem of evil, racism, and oppression. You can't do urban apologetics effectively without dealing with the intersection between the problem of evil, racism, and oppression. Okay. I say that because with the Black community, the problem of evil isn't just some distant intellectual problem. It's on the evening news. It's on your Facebook feed when you see another unarmed Black man's gunned down by the police or some citizen. It's in your bank account, maybe. As our community deals with the echoing effects of Jim Crow from an economic standpoint. Basically, this problem of evil is like a common thread that undergirds our cultural identity, if you will, the Black experience, right? Because you got to think about it. When our people were taken from West Africa, we weren't just one monolithic group. We come from different tribes, whether it be the Yoruba, the Ewe, the Dahomey, the Fulani, and so forth. We come from different tribes. And then, we basically were all lumped together under this one predicament of slavery, right? And, the struggle, if you will. So in a sense, the struggle is undergirds, this collective identity, our collective history here in the West, right? Another way to put it would be to say that our a community or collective identity, in terms of how it developed, was incubated in oppression, right? But in so many ways, it was also nurtured by the gospel, right? And that's so key to understanding, because see, that's why when you think about you see the outworkings, if you will, of the gospel woven into and throughout our community's history in terms of how we thrived and overcame different obstacles and forms of suffering, even up to the present day. That's why if you really want to understand something about Black philosophy, as I do, I'm a philosophy nerd. If you want to understand something about Black philosophy, you got to know where to look, right? You got to know where to look. You can learn something from the pen of, that great scholar like W.E.B. Du Bois, who made waves in academia. But you've also got to wrestle with the pain, the hope, and determination of a Fannie Lou Hamer from rural Mississippi. You've got to listen to what was coming across the pulpit of Absalom Jones, right? You've got to deal with the mind of Frederick Douglass, who published his abolitionist newspaper, the North Star, in the basement of an AME Zion church, right? That's where you have to look. If you want to understand Black philosophy and how we grapple with the problem of evil, that's where you've got to look to, because our philosophers were in the trenches, if you will. Our philosophers were in the trenches. And so it's so important, I think for us, I can't get into it all today. I'll maybe take a snippet, but as you're wrestling with these issues and providing answers within the urban context, we actually have a rich history that flows, parallel with African-American history, where we can, really grapple with this issue from a biblical perspective. Okay. All right. So I could go on like that, man, about that. I'm a history guy and I love philosophy, but I'll try to keep it moving a little bit. So with that being said, when you think about these different worldviews that we find ourselves engaging in the urban context, whether it be the Hebrew Israelites, the Kemetics and the Moors, given that this problem of evil is such a fact of reality for African-American history, or basically Africans of the diaspora in terms of our history and identity, you're going to find each of these worldviews trying to give their own responses to the problem of evil. It's really a linchpin of all these different groups, if you really think about it. So, for example, the Hebrew Israelite, they're going to say, well, why are Black people in bad shape? Well, it's because you're a Hebrew and our people broke the old covenant laws, and now we got to get back right. We got to come back to the laws, right? Whereas the Moors are going to say, no, Black people are in bad shape. The reason why we're suffering and enduring this evil is because you're a Moor and you're unaware of your citizenship rights. You got to claim your citizenship rights and your citizenship and the rights thereof, rather, and then ride this thing out till the end times. That's what the Moors are going to say. And then the Kemetics are going to be like, well, I don't know about all that. But the reason why I think we're in bad shape here as a people, and the reason why we're enduring this evil and suffering over here, is because we've abandoned the ways of our ancestors. So we need to get back to our ancestors' ways, philosophy, culture, spirituality, and so forth, right? So all these groups are trying to give their own responses to the problem of evil. And so if we understand that, then one thing I always like to point out is that sometimes people who aren't accustomed to urban apologetics, they might see like the Hebrew Israelites, for example, is just a bunch of black dudes standing on the corner, yelling about something. But no, I mean, if you really think about the centerpiece of their theology, they're grappling with the problem of evil just like everybody else is. They're just doing it, while wearing uniforms that look like Power Ranger outfits or something like that, But ultimately, it's the core of it is the problem of evil. That's what they're dealing with. Okay, all right. Just a second. I know we're going to be ready to take some initial Q&A, but I just want to make a few quick points. In terms of how we encounter the problem of evil, it's very important that we make at least one more distinction, which is that you're going to encounter the problem of evil in ways that people call, what we can call the emotional problem of evil versus the intellectual problem of evil. Okay. Now, obviously, the emotional problem of evil, we're talking about just grappling with the sting of maybe that death in the family or having somebody having wronged you or something like that. They're on an emotional level. And I would say this is probably the most powerful aspect of the problem of evil is the emotional impact of engaging or bumping up against evil and suffering in the world versus the intellectual problem of evil, where you're just kind of dealing with the philosophical arguments, if you will, or the philosophical side, that head part of wrapping one's mind around the problem of evil. That's kind of the intellectual side. So you got the emotional side and the intellectual side, right? And on the intellectual side, probably the two most prominent versions of the argument that we see is going to be the logical version of the problem of evil and what's called the probability version. So we'll get to those in a second. But I just want to make sure that we make this distinction because you don't want to be given the wrong medication to the problem. All right. So just as an analogy, a couple of years ago, I had to get a root canal, right? And as I'm doing this root canal, as I'm preparing for this root canal, rather, the dentist says, hey, I'm going to give you two medications. I'm going to give you some Tylenol and I'm going to give you some antibiotics, right? We need to give you the antibiotics because that's going to clear up the infection so we can get in there and do what we need to do. And the Tylenol is going to take your pain away, okay? So I've got one problem, but two medications, right? So it's the same thing when it comes to the problem of evil. We've got one problem, but we're going to need to apply, in most cases, two different kinds of medications. We're going to need to be able to minister to the emotional side of that problem, but also have something that minister to the intellectual side to that problem. And we will make sure we don't want to get that those two confused. Lastly, before we run into this break here, I just want to shout out or bring out rather, there's ways that we can take pressure off of ourselves as we're engaging in these conversations. Okay. First of all, just a real quick recap. The problem of evil is for everybody. One of the things it's like nails on the chalkboard for me. One thing that I can't stand is that as Christians, we always paint ourselves in the corner and get into conversations as if we have to give all the answers. And if we can't convince everybody, then there's obviously we fail. But that's not true, right? Everybody has to grapple with the problem of evil. So if you find somebody who's trying to lob that at you as an objection to Christianity, just remember that we can give our biblical response and then put the burden back on them and say, okay, well, here's the response I've given. Now, your worldview, how does your worldview account for the problem of evil? So it takes the pressure off because we're not the only ones having to respond. Number two is this issue of what we call rational justification. That's just a fancy way of saying that we have good reasons to affirm what it is that we affirm about Christianity, that Christianity is true and they can handle the problem of evil. Here's the thing. Sometimes people feel like just because they don't convince somebody else that Christianity is true or convince somebody else that they're giving a good response to the problem of evil, for example, that somehow they failed in the conversation. And that's not the case. Just because somebody disagrees with me doesn't mean that I don't have good reason. Doesn't mean I don't have rational justification for affirming Christianity and the fact that it answers the problem of evil. People have to deal with the truth on their own, but I can still have rational justification regardless of whether they agree with me or not. And then lastly, one thing I like to say is that everything that feels good isn't true. And just because something is true doesn't mean it feels good. We have to understand that when we're dealing with the intellectual side of the problem of evil, it's not a magic wand that wipes everybody's emotions away and makes everybody feel good about evil. If you feel good about evil, there's probably something wrong with you. You know what I'm saying? So we're all going to deal with that emotional sting, but it takes more than the intellectual side, which we'll get into to grapple with it. And lastly, and I'll say this for a second, but I would argue that evil actually points to the existence of God rather than away from it. But we'll get into that in a second. So I'll pause for some questions.
Wow, brother, you're blessing us, man. I just want you to, I want to say this real quick because I know you can't see the Facebook live chat right now as you're presenting, but man, I'm monitoring the Facebook live chat, and people are just saying you're breaking it down. You're really making it plain, man. So we really appreciate that, because we want to make this urban apologetics very accessible for everyday believers. And you've already been bringing up some stuff that really applies the apologetics to the evangelism itself. And so, brother, you're doing an excellent job. Let's go ahead and get into the questions. So please, if you have questions, go ahead and type them into the chat section, and I'm going to be fielding some of these questions for the next 10-15 minutes, and then we'll have Brother Adam finish his presentation. So let's go ahead and take some questions here. So here's the first question. So how do you find a common connection with different groups and guide them to a biblical and relevant interpretation of the said scriptures? Mm-hmm. And I'm imagining that that's dealing with this particular issue that we're talking about. But yeah, that common connection with different groups and then guide them to that. What would you say to that, brother?
Right. So I want to think about Romans chapter 1. Okay, really Romans chapter 1-3, where it kind of gives us an idea of God's general revelation. There are some things that whether somebody is a Christian or not, whether they're a believer or not, there's some things that they can know that's true about reality based upon just God's creation. So they can know that there is a creator. Given that God has written his law on our hearts, to which we're all accountable to, they can know that there's a moral reality. We'll talk about that in a little while. There's just some things that are a common experience, just being human in the world, that point to God. And so what I want to do is I want to highlight that. You know what I'm saying? My perspective is, I think sometimes we're maybe too quick to just basically tell people that they're wrong on every single thing. I mean, and it's easy when you're in battle mode on Facebook, you know what I mean? Like, you don't want to concede any points, but sometimes if somebody is right about something, or if there's something about God's general revelation that they've latched onto and understood, that's where I want to go. You know what I'm saying? I want to say, okay, cool. It's just like with perfect example, the book of Acts, chapter 17. Okay. Paul's walking through with the Athenians, and he says, look, I see you've got this statue here to the unknown God. All right, now you're right that there's this unknown God, but let me show you who he is. Right now, the Athenians were engaged in all kind of pagan worship and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it was wilding out. But Paul identified something where they latched onto a snippet of truth, and then he directed them, even using some of their own poets. Right? He said, "I'm even quoting some of y'all poets." Right? He was able to use that and say, "Okay, well, here's where you picked up on something. Now let me take you the rest of the way by God's revelation." And so the way that we do that is highlighting God's general revelation, things that they may have picked up on, but then also going to that word, man, demonstrating, like, again, making it plain, showing the person, okay, well, here's what the Bible says, and here's how it plays out in the human experience. And a lot of times I think that's it. You're able to kind of connect the dots there, right?
That's excellent, brother. That's helpful. That's very helpful. We have another question here for you. And again, please feel free, go ahead and type in your questions in the chat. We're going to take another few minutes to answer questions here just on what he's presented so far. But here's the question: how do we get our white brothers and sisters in Christ to understand the focus on the Black experience in this moment in time versus all lives matter? And so I'm sure you hear that pushback, Brother Adam, a lot, where it's like, we try to say Black lives matter, which you already said is rooted in the image of God, which is biblical truth. And then we get pushback that all lives matter. And so, and it can come across as very dismissive in light of what you laid out excellently, as far as just what we've experienced as just suffering in the Black experience. So what would you say to how do we get people to focus on that, our white brothers and sisters in Christ?
Well, I think you're gonna get me in trouble. I'm gonna lose like 1,000 subscribers on how I answer this question. But well, I think it depends on the person that you're dealing with. We have to understand that, I mean, everybody's not the same. You know what I'm saying? And to various different degrees. Well, let me say this: when I was growing up, I was under the impression that you had basically two types of white people. You got racist and you have non-racist. What I realize now, that actually there's a broader spectrum. You have people that are kind of in the middle, who are either have imbibed some racist ideas from society and may or may not be aware of it, or you have some people that are truly ignorant as to the African American experience. They honestly don't know. There's different kinds of people out there, And so I think just out of grace, you know what I'm saying, we can, first of all, try to gauge where people are. I'm saying, don't make assumptions about where they are. Try to really engage and figure out what category this person falls into. You know what I'm saying? Because I'm going to respond to somebody who's in rebellion against God's truth about the Imago Dei, for example, differently than I'm going to respond to somebody who's literally ignorant, like they literally don't know. Also, with that being said, though, we're instructed in Ephesians chapter 14. I want to say it's verse 26 or something, 25 or 26. We're instructed to tell the truth to one another. I'm saying we're instructed to be truth tellers, right? We're supposed to be telling the truth in love, right? So we can't sugarcoat the realities of brokenness in this world and how it's impacting us just because it's going to make somebody else feel bad. Now we can speak, such that we're administering grace to the hearer, definitely that. But I think that we have to be careful not to shy away from the truth. I'm saying you got to tell the truth, man. If you want to boot me off after I say this, you can, but I got to go in right quick. But one of the things we have to realize, listen, when I first started doing Tru-ID, the Tru-ID stands for the real you Imago Dei. And the reason why I started the podcast is because the different worldviews that I was dealing with, like the Hebrew Israelites, Moors, Muslims, and so forth, identity seemed to be the linchpin of their ideology. And I'm saying that the real you is the image of God, right? And so I'm calling people to that. And so that's where I started my ministry. But I realized as I was applying that lens consistently across society, I realized that this identity issue isn't just with Black people, right? There's an identity issue that runs through a particular segment of the white community where they take their association with the nation, you know what I'm saying, with America, and it's in some way intersected with their self-concept. So when I say something about American history, when I say, you know what, Kaepernick was right, that in the War of 1812, Africans were fighting against America for their freedom. Kaepernick is right about that. When I say something like that, and I say something about American history, they feel that I'm coming at them. Why? Because that part of their that nationalistic aspect of their identity, or maybe whiteness perhaps, like that part of their identity has in some way become an idol. You know what I'm saying? So we have to understand that there's people have idols of all different sorts, and sometimes people don't want to see racism, because if you're saying that America's racist, then you're really saying something about me. You're forcing me to look in the mirror, and I know I'm not a racist, so I know I don't have that problem. So why are you coming to me like that? What I'm saying ultimately is that anytime you take a feature of who you are, whether it be your ethnicity, race, and so forth, anytime you take a feature of who you are and make it the foundation of who you are, rather than the Imago Dei, then you're going to create an idol that ultimately is going to cause you to live out something immoral or think something immoral towards your fellow image bearers. And I'm saying that when it comes to white folks in this country, and not just white people, but I mean, anybody who esteems America as being the greatest of all time or whatever, a lot of times what you're dealing with is people have an ungodly perspective of a nation that's just as man-made as anything else, thus, subject to the brokenness of this world. They have an idea about this nation that's overinflated, by what they've been told. And I'm trying to call you back to the gospel. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to call you back to that, all have sinned. I'm trying to call you back to, we've all been, we're all dealing with this brokenness, and you cannot take a feature of who you are and make it the foundation. But sometimes that's uncomfortable for folks. Sometimes it's uncomfortable, but they need that though. We all need that. We all need it. The same way I'm gonna go with the Hebrew Israelite, the same way I'm gonna go with the Kemetic for having the wrong basis of identity. I'm gonna go at the dude who believes that America can do no wrong. I'm gonna keep that same energy. You know what I'm saying? And it's funny because sometimes cats will cheer me on when I'm dealing with the Hebrew Israelites, but when I take that same biblical truth and apply it to their nationalism, all of a sudden it's a problem. I'm keeping the Bible consistent, man, and that's what we need to do.
Brother.
I hope I ain't cost y'all some followers there, but yeah.
Hey, brother, we're about speaking truth here at Epiphany Fellowship, of course, doing it in love with grace and compassion, and I think, and everyone on the chat, I think, agrees with you, because they're just going in on as you were just laying that out. People just right. Going in, so we're all with you, brother, and so no, you're fine. We're going to take a couple more questions, and then we're going to get back to the presentation. We got so many questions flowing in.
Cool, good. That's great, man.
Oh yeah, we'll take a couple more. We'll get back to the presentation. I just want to take this time real quick to plug you real quick. Is you've been laying it out there, but everyone, the Tru-ID podcast, that's Adam Coleman's podcast. Please subscribe to that, review, like it, share it. Tru-ID Apologetics podcast. He has a lot of great content on there. He also has a YouTube page that you can subscribe to and like that and share it and just get a lot of great content there as well. So just want to plug you there, brother. And then also want to just plug the Surge Evangelism Ministry real quick. If anyone wants to be a part of what we're doing as far as evangelism, urban apologetics, justice outreaches and things like that, email me at jcjones@epiphanyfellowship.org for any questions you have, or if you want to be a part of it, if you want to join the ministry. So here's another question. We're going to take a couple more questions and then we're going to dive back into the presentation because he was really just getting started. He's going to be really wrestling with these arguments and things like that.
Right.
So we got a lot more content, great content coming from our brother. But here's some questions, pressing questions people are asking, brother. So two people asked pretty much the same question, so I'll sum it up. So they're really getting at, okay, when you're dealing with people who are, they're just not making sense, they don't have a sense of morality themselves, or they have this reprobate mind, and so they're just really not hearing it, or they don't even have the categories or framework to really engage in these discussions. What do you do? They ask, do you just plant the seed of the gospel? Do you just pray for them privately? Do you just keep it moving? Can you just speak to that real quick for some of the people asking that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm trying not go too far afield. But first of all, I love this quote that I attributed to Robert Zacharias. He may have got it from somebody else, but he would always say that the gospel is the steak, right? Apologetics is the seasoning. Okay, we want to make sure that we don't get those two confused. The gospel is the steak, apologetics is the seasoning. Now when you think about it, we can't underestimate the power of the gospel. It's the power of God into salvation, right? So sometimes, you may not necessarily need to get into all this apologetic stuff. You can start with the gospel, and if they're rolling with that, that's going to be the most important thing, because if they're able to, if God, grafts them in and they're regenerated, then the Holy Spirit's now working on them to work through these kinds of things. So sometimes it's really just that's just the case. We need to just kind of sow the seed of the gospel, keep it moving, pray for them. Don't underestimate the power of prayer and so forth. In other instances where people just don't get it, to be honest with you, this is going to sound kind of harsh, but I say it all the time. Most people are poor historians and even worse philosophers. Most people, they hear things on the internet or somewhere in society, and they just really haven't taken time to really think these things through. And so one aspect of apologetics, and actually I probably should have said this earlier, but apologetics is not just about answering questions. It's also about helping people, coming alongside people and help them to navigate difficult questions, right? And so take your time. Sometimes, you might be dealing with somebody who's totally irrational, but if they're willing to engage with you in a peaceable manner, take your time and kind of just walk them through where they might be having these logical missteps. Sometimes you have to sow a seed even in that regard, and then come back to it later if you have the opportunity. But one thing you don't want to do is feel like somehow you failed or something like that. People are at various different stages in their spiritual development or spiritual state, various different stages in terms of their mental capacities and so forth. And so at any given time, the best thing you can do is just sow the seed that you can. And then whether that interaction is successful or not in your estimation, either way, pray for them. I'm saying, because you don't want the seed of the gospel to be snatched away, if you will. I'm saying you want God to water that seed so that maybe somebody else can come along behind it, and God will give the increase. Yeah.
Excellent, brother. Excellent. And people appreciated the analogy there. And so I think that was very understandable. So let's do this. I'm going to save the other questions till the end. Let's go ahead and get back into the presentation, man. I know you got some good content that you want to go ahead and cover. You're just getting warmed up, man.
Yeah. We just getting started, bro. Get your popcorn ready. You know what I'm saying?
So go ahead and dive back into your presentation, man. And then for everyone that's on with us, we're going to do another Q&A session at the end. So he's going to finish up his presentation, and then we're going to do another 10 or 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. So be thinking about any other questions you have. Feel free to type them in the chat, and we will get to those questions. You all are asking some really good questions. Let's get back into it.
Okay, cool. Hey, just to let you know too, like when I started my timer, I started a couple minutes late, so if I'm going way over, then just let me know. You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
That's a trick of the trade right there. It's a public speaking trick of the trade. You start your timer late. That way, when you go over, you can say, "Oh, well, I was looking at my clock." You know,
Yeah,
give myself an excuse to go over. You know what I'm saying?
you're good. You're good, brother. You're good, brother.
Yeah.
I would
All
say
right.
we're coming, just for sake of time. We're coming up at 11, so I say go for another 35 minutes, and then we'll do our last Q&A. How about that?
Beautiful. Okay.
All right.
Just give me a sign if I'm running up on it. Okay.
I got you, brother.
All right. Cool. So where I ended off. Okay. Do they see my slides and whatnot?
Yep. You're good to go.
Okay, cool. So, where I left off is I was talking about taking the pressure off. And the last thing I talked about was how actually I would argue that evil, rather than pointing away from God's existence, it actually points towards God's existence. Okay, so this is actually a kind of a picture version, if you will, of an argument that we can give to that end. Okay, now remember I talked about the difference between objective evil and subjective evil. Excuse me, objective morality and subjective morality. Okay, now if somebody is bringing up the argument from evil, they're probably not talking about subjective morality, because if they say, okay, well, slavery was wrong, and they have a subjective view, then that's equivalent to them saying that vanilla ice cream is better than chocolate ice cream. It's just their subjective opinion. If that's the case, then their argument is not really going to have any teeth. Okay, if the argument from evil is to have any teeth at all, they're going to have to make it from an objective standpoint. They're going to have to say something like it's objectively wrong that George Floyd was killed, why would God allow that, or so forth. Okay, now here's the thing. Once they make that step, then we can kind of walk through this line of reasoning here. So you hear Robert Zacharias share this all the time. So if there is a such thing as objective evil, then that would suggest that there must be an objective good. But if there's an objective evil and objective good, then there must be an objective moral law by which we can differentiate or tell the difference between good and evil. But the thing is, if there's an objective moral law, then that would suggest that there must be an objective moral law giver. There has to be a source for this objective moral law, right? But if there's an objective moral law giver, then I would argue that the best explanation for what that lawgiver is God, okay? Now, all the action is going to be, well, how do you get from there being this moral law to there being this moral lawgiver that you're calling God? Like, how do you make that step? Is that a logical leap? Well, no, because we can give arguments for that. Now, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be doing a presentation on atheism where I can get into this much further. But just real quick, I'm just going to give you an example of why we can make this argument from getting from a moral law to moral lawgiver and justifying that it's God. Now, think about your moral experience. Okay, we think about our moral experience. Remember, I talked about how you have natural evil and you have moral evil. Okay, so let's talk about natural evil for a second. All right, let's say that, when a child, dies from cancer or COVID-19, or, when a hurricane hits a place or earthquake and a bunch of people die from it, we all feel, the pain of that. We know that there's something, wrong about it, there's something evil about that, in a sense. That's that natural evil. Well, what is that sense that we have? Is this notion that, this is not how things ought to be. This is not how things ought to be. It ought not to be the case that children die young and so on and so forth. It shouldn't be. Now, here's the thing. If there's a way that things ought to be, then another way of putting it is that there are intentions for how things are supposed to go in the world, right? There's a way that things ought to be. There's a way that things are supposed to happen, right? Now, where do intentions come from? Where do intentions come from? Now, like, this roll of tape right here, for example. This roll of tape doesn't have intentions. It just sits on the table and that's it. Where do intentions come from? Well, we know that the kinds of things that have intentions are minds, right? They're minds, M-I-N-D-S. So if there are intentions behind the world, right, and how things ought to be, that would suggest there must be some sort of mind behind it all, a mind that has the intentions for how things should go in the world. All right, now just hold on to that for a second, okay? Let's talk about moral evil. When you think about our moral experience, when we think about what we ought to do or what we ought not to do, in our moral experience, we kind of have the sense of that there's these commands. There's these things that we should and shouldn't do. So if I walk into a bank and want to withdraw some money or something like that from my bank account, all right, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. That's a good thing. If I walk into a bank and pull a gun out and say I want to withdraw money from everybody else's account, that's bad. That's a bad thing. That's stealing, right? And so and other things, right? So we understand the difference between moral, moral good, or excuse me, right and wrong, right? There are these moral duties, if you will. Okay. Now, when you think about a moral experience, we have the sense that, okay, well, I ought not to do that. Well, where does that sense come from? How is it that we have these commands that we're aware of, if you will? Well, commands come from commanders, right? They come from commanders. They don't just come out of nowhere. Or if we could put it a different way, we can say that it's like we've got this internal message that we ought to do or ought not to do this or that. Well, messages come from messengers, right? So let's say, for example, you're walking down a beach and you see some twigs on the beach, just kind of just thrown around randomly. You probably wouldn't take any note of it. Let's say you walk a little further and you see spelled out, JC, there's danger here, turn back, go back to where you came from. You just see that spelled out in twigs on the beach. Now, you wouldn't say, man, that's just amazing how the wave just washed these sticks up on the shore and just randomly formed this message to me. You wouldn't say something like that. It would be rational for you to infer, given that there's a message, it would be rational for you to infer that there must be a messenger who has some intentions for what you ought to do in that moment. Okay, well, in the same sense, we have this internal message of what you ought or ought not to do. We can infer that there must be a messenger. Messages comes from messengers, right? So, there must be some messenger, right, behind the moral experience that we all encounter. Now, you could call that messenger the intender, commander, moral messenger behind all reality, but Christians, we just call that God. You know what I'm saying? And that's how we get from, this moral law to God. God is the mind and the commander and the one who issues these moral messages that we pick up on in our conscience that help us to navigate the moral reality, right? So if that's the case, then again, if you have objective evil, then there must be an objective good. If you got objective good and evil, then that suggests there must be a moral lawgiver. If you have this moral lawgiver, the best explanation, I would argue, to account for these intentions, oughts, and the moral commands that we experience, the best explanation is God. Now, if you take God out of the picture, then all that falls apart. You don't have a grounding for that moral law or to say that anything is good or evil, right? Now, what's interesting about that, then you have a problem that arises for the atheist or whoever's raising this objection, right? Because without God, the whole moral framework, the whole framework of morality, rather, falls apart, including objective morality or objective evil. So the person objecting to Christianity, if you will, they actually need God in the picture to even make their argument work, right? And if you throw morality out of the picture, then there's other things that go along with it, such as human value, right? And we'll get into that in a couple of weeks when I deal with the with atheism in the African American context. But I said all that to say, it's kind of like, as apologist Frank Turek puts it, he says that, when it comes to arguments from evil, atheists have to borrow from theism, the worldview in which, people affirm that God exists. Atheists have to borrow from theism in order to make their case against theism. And so, like I said all that to say, just kind of to go back to my point, I actually would argue that the existence of evil in the world actually points to the existence of God rather than away from it. Okay. So those are just some things, again, we're just trying to take the teeth out of the argument from evil. Okay. But now we're actually going to go into the teeth. We're going to, shift gears a little bit. We're going to be dealing with two prominent forms of the problem of evil and how we can respond to them. Okay. Now, I want to make clear that, again, we're just kind of dealing with two of them. These are probably the two that you're most likely going to come in contact with. But the argument for me, there's a whole family of them. You have some where it's like an argument from animal suffering, where people say the animals shouldn't be suffering and so God doesn't exist. Or some would say the argument from hiddenness is a form of the problem of evil. Why can't I sense God? Or how is it that God hasn't made himself apparent or something like that in the world, or apparent enough, that sort of thing. So there's all different kinds of the problem of evil. We'll be dealing with, I think, to be the two most prominent ones, okay? So this isn't just like abstract either. I mean, these things have real world implications. I wish I had time to go into it, but this actually is a picture of a guy named Martin Delany. He's one of the OGs of Pan-Africanism. They actually consider him to be a forefather of Pan-Africanism. You can put it this way: if there was a Mount Rushmore for Pan-Africanists, Martin Delany would definitely be up there among maybe three others who also would have been Christians. But anyway, in one of his works, and I'm going to mess this title up because it's like a super long title, so I'm actually going to have to read it off my notes here for a second. Excuse me. It's like a super long title. Okay, so in his book that he wrote called "The Condition, Elevation, Immigration, and Destiny of Colored People of the United States and the Official Report of the Niger Valley Exploring Party." It's a long title. Actually, I think Martin's a man after my own heart. It's kind of long with it, but in that book, I think it's in chapter 3, he mentions how, and you can see in this quote right here, that God he operates in the world through fixed laws that are grounded in his nature. And one of the laws that Martin Delany mentions is the moral law that's grounded in God's nature. Now, he wrote this work in, I want to say it's like 1852, right? So I said that to say, Martin Delaney, his argument was that if the black community is going to build, then it's going to have to be on the foundation of these laws that are grounded in God's nature, one of which being the moral law. And I've got a session on my YouTube page, Tru-ID Apologetics on YouTube, where I go into more depth on that. But I just said that to say that these things that we're talking about, they're not abstract. They have real world applications, in terms of how we navigate the world. All right, so let's get into it. Logical problem of evil. Okay. I'm just going to go ahead and read it out right quick. Excuse me. This is the logical version of the problem of evil. It says, it is logically impossible for God and suffering to exist. Okay, that's premise one. Premise two, suffering exists. And therefore, the conclusion, God does not exist. Okay, that's the logical version of the problem of evil. Now, what we're looking at here is what's called a deductive argument. A deductive argument is basically a series of statements where the first few statements in the series are supposed to be supportive of the last statement, which is supposed to be the conclusion. So your first statements, those premises, are supposed to lead you to the conclusion. That's what a deductive argument is all about. So it says it is logically impossible for God and suffering to exist. Suffering exists, therefore God does not exist. Okay. Now, real quick, we have to understand that philosophy is kind of like chess. I like to use this analogy. It's like chess in the sense that if you're in the game, if you step into a chess game, you don't know how the pieces work, then you're not going to be able to play the game. But philosophy, it's like these different philosophical concepts that philosophers employ in their argumentation. Those are like the chess pieces. If we know how those concepts work, then it'll help us to be able to play the game, so to speak. Okay. Now, first of all, I want to take note that you notice I'm shifting a little bit from using the term evil. Now I'm using the term suffering in this argument. The reason why I'm doing that is often atheists and other objectors will use the term suffering in this argument because they believe it gives them a stronger case, right? They want to avoid the argument that I just gave about how evil points to God. They want to avoid that, so they're not going to use the term evil. They're going to use suffering, something that's just a fact of the matter, in reality, and they can kind of get around the objection that I just gave. So they're going to use, and plus two, suffering is observable. So they feel that they've got a better ground to say that suffering exists. Okay, so that's where we're shifting gears a little bit. I want to make sure that we're tackling the strongest arguments, because if we tackle the stronger ones, then the weaker ones, we can knock those out as well. Okay, so what are the key concepts here that we have to understand, those chess pieces that we're going to need in order to defeat this argument? Okay, real quick, there's two main ones. You have what's called logical inconsistency and logical impossibility. Logical inconsistency and logical impossibility. Now, the word logic here, just to be clear, all fields, if you will, I'm saying by fields, I mean like career fields or fields of study, they all have their different jargon, right? So if I use the term depression, I say, hey man, JC, I feel depressed, you might interpret that, I feel sad that day or something like that. Now, if I go to a psychiatrist and say I feel depressed, or they tell me that I'm depressed, they mean that in a more specific way. They mean that I have some sort of chemical imbalance or something of that nature. They mean it in a more strict sense. Same thing with the word logic here. When philosophers use the word logic, they don't mean like just something that makes sense to somebody. They're using it in a more strict sense, as in basically that an argument or a statement follows the rules of reasoning that the field of philosophy recognizes that one needs to come to right conclusions or to arrange a solid argument. That's what they mean by logic, okay? All right, so when we're dealing with logical inconsistency, it's this notion that if you have a set of statements and they can't all be true at the same time, then those statements are logically inconsistent, okay? A set of statements is logically inconsistent if they cannot be all true at the same time, okay? Logical impossibility, and we'll do some examples of this, is when you're dealing with a single statement, right? And there's something contradictory within that single statement, okay? Let's go to the box and give some examples. All right, here's a little quiz for y'all. What's in the box, okay? Think about these two statements, this set of statements here. A, the item in the box is made entirely of marshmallows, okay? Or B, the item in the box is made entirely of metal. Now, can both statement A and statement B both be true? Can it be the case that the item in this box is made entirely of marshmallows, and at the same time, this single item in the box is made entirely of metal? The answer is no, because and the key is that word entirely. Saying the item in the box can't physically be made entirely of one substance, and at the same time physically be made entirely of another substance. So these two statements are logically inconsistent with one another. So if two statements are logically inconsistent, then we know at least one of them is false. Okay. All right. So that's logical inconsistency. Logical impossibility, you want to think about, say, can it be possible to have a square with three sides and three angles, right? Well, no, that's a triangle. By definition, the square has four sides and four angles. A triangle has three sides and three angles. So a square by definition, can't have three sides, right? So if I say that I found if I told you, hey, I'll give you $1 million if you go down the street and find me a square with three sides, you wouldn't leave your computer. You wouldn't leave your seat where you are right now, because just off top that's logically impossible. There's no reason for you to go looking for it because it doesn't exist. It's nonsense. Okay, that's what people are talking about when they use the term logical impossibility. It's logically impossible. Or the notion of there being a married bachelor. You can't be married and be a bachelor, right? Either you're married or you're not, right? Okay, so going back to the argument here, that's what we're dealing with when they say in that first premise that I've highlighted here, it's logically impossible for God and suffering to exist. Basically, they're saying that in the real world, they can't both be in existence at the same time. It's got to be either one or the other. It's kind of like in the old days with the old cowboy movies. They would say there's not enough room in this town for the both of us, right? So the atheist is saying that there's not enough room in reality for both God and suffering to exist. And so because we can observe suffering and know that exists, therefore we're going to conclude, if these two things are logically inconsistent, that therefore God doesn't exist. That's the engine that's kind of running this car of this argument, if you will. Okay. Now, here's the problem for the atheist, or for whoever's making the objection, is that if they're saying that it's impossible for God and evil to exist, they've actually set a high bar for themselves. They've set this high bar of impossibility. They're saying that there's no possible way that God and evil, or God and suffering, can exist within the real world. So that actually makes it easy for us, because all we have to do is introduce a possibility. All we have to do is introduce a what if scenario in which God and evil could possibly exist in the same world. That's all we need to defeat this argument, is a what if. Okay. Now, when you look at this notion of God exists and suffering exists, there's nothing about it that's like some sort of direct logical contradiction or direct logical impossibility, in the same sense of like a square circle, or a square with three sides. Immediately you see a square can't have three sides, but there's nothing that immediately jumps out at you that says that suffering and God can't exist. And so the only way that the atheists can make this case is that they have to have two hidden assumptions. Okay, they have to have two hidden assumptions in order to support this argument. So what we're going to do is we're going to chop away those two hidden assumptions, which will then kill that first premise and then kill the whole argument. That's where we're going. Okay. Now, what are those two hidden assumptions? All right. The first hidden assumption is, if God is all powerful, then he can create any world he wants. Okay. The second assumption is, if God is all loving, he prefers a world without suffering. Now, like one thing I say all the time is that usually most people that you're dealing with, they're probably not all that sharp when it comes to theology. They probably haven't done their homework in terms of what people mean, what people like me mean when they say all powerful. The proper way to understand God's omnipotence, or that he's all powerful, the proper way to understand that is that God can do anything that's logically possible. I'm saying, if you look in the literature, that's really what theologians mean. God can do anything that's logically possible. And so what I mean by that is, God is, can't create a square with three sides, not because he doesn't have the power to, but because it's nonsense. It's gibberish. It's like, it's a meaningless concept. You know what I'm saying? God himself is the grounding of all logic. So he doesn't do things that are illogical. You could maybe look at it differently that way. Okay. Is it the case, that God can, if he's all powerful, he can create any world he wants? Well, all we have to do here is introduce a possibility. All right. Now, before we get to this possibility, I want to make clear that this is one of those instances in which, I recognize that I'm dealing with a group that's theologically diverse. And so you got to really key in on some of the nuances that I'm putting in place, because actually what I'm going to offer, I think anybody of any theological persuasion can use the argument, but I want to make sure I put in certain nuances so we're all on the same page. And so for clarity, this next point, I want to make sure I said that, okay? And y'all will understand why. Okay, so let's enter into one possibility to refute this first hidden assumption, okay, from the atheist, right? It could be that God desires a world of creatures with free will because he has some morally sufficient reason to do so. That's a possibility. And by morally sufficient, in this case, I mean reasons that are enough to justify allowing evil. It could be the case that God wants a world with free creatures, right? Now, this is probably the most popular way to undercut the first hidden assumption. But again, it's to suggest that God could or has created a world of creatures with free will. Now, obviously, the concept of a world of people who are forced to make free decisions, that's logical nonsense. Okay, because by definition, if something is forced, then it's not free. You're not freely choosing if something is forced. It's a forced free choice. Is like saying that there's a square, with three sides. It's logical nonsense. Now, again, it's not a matter of whether God can do it or can't do it. It's just that it's nonsense. And God doesn't, he doesn't do illogical things or things that are logically nonsensical. Now, if it is possible, again, it's possible that for his purposes, God has morally sufficient reason to create a world full of people with free will. And yet such a world, it could be that it's inevitable that people will use that free will to do wrong. And so therefore, evil and suffering gets in the back door through those wrong decisions. And saying that's a very real possibility. I'll leave out for now, why God might have more than sufficient reasons to do that. There's arguments that folks make to that. Maybe we'll come back to it during the Q&A. But the first thing I want to say, even if that's possible, if it's even possible that God has reason to create a world with free creatures, then already we've killed that first hidden assumption. Now, here's the thing. Here's where we're going to add in some nuance. Now, I recognize that, say, for example, people of the Reformed persuasion, they may take exception to that notion of free will. Different theological perspectives have different views on what that means, right? But I want to make sure that we're clear that what we're aiming at here is attacking that impossibility high bar that the atheist has set. So it could be that if you're a Calvinist, you could say that it is in fact the case that God has not created a world with creatures with free will. Nevertheless, it's possible that he could have if he wanted to. And if it's even possible, then we still killed that first hidden assumption. And therefore, this aspect of the argument fails, if it's even possible. Okay. So maybe we can come back to that if people need to. But secondly, what about that second hidden assumption? If God is all loving, he prefers a world without suffering. Is that necessarily true? I'm saying, does that have to be the case? Well, again, I would say no, because it's possible that suffering can have a purpose. Okay, it can have a morally sufficient purpose. So real quick, a couple years ago, my son, he's 5 now, but at the time he was 3, he was bitten by our dog. And long story short, his hand got infected and we had to take him to the ER. And the ERs, folks at the ER, they were like, look, we need to give him some antibiotics, intravenously, through the vein. So I actually had to hold my son down while they stuck his needle in his arm. And he doesn't understand what's going on. He's crying. He's looking up at me. He can't understand why I'm allowing these people to subject him to this pain. But I know I've got morally sufficient reason to allow this pain in this instance because the medicine that he's getting through the needle, right, is going to save his life. And so I've good reason in that instance to allow him to go through this pain, right? So likewise, sometimes our pain does have a purpose, and in order for the atheists to substantiate this argument, they would have to argue that it's impossible that suffering has a purpose. And nobody's in a position to say that. We don't know enough about, history, the future, and all the events of our lives, and how it interacts with others to know whether or not, the things that we encounter, the suffering we encounter in this world has a purpose or not. You can't say definitively that it's impossible that God lacks morally sufficient reason for allowing suffering. So if that's a possibility, then that kills their second assumption. And so with those two hidden assumptions out of the way, then the first premise of the argument fails. It's not the case that it's impossible that God and suffering exists. It could be the case that, whether it be due to free will and suffering gets in the back door, or suffering having a purpose, it could be the case that suffering and God do exist in the real world, and so therefore, without premise one, the whole argument fails and that falls apart. As a matter of fact, just to quote him real quick, there's an atheist philosopher by the name of J.L. Mackie. He's one of those OG atheist philosophers from the 20th century. He puts it this way in his book, The Miracle of Theism. He says, we can concede that the problem of evil does not, after all, show that the central doctrines of theism are logically inconsistent with one another. So, that just really speaks to this issue that honestly, right now in the philosophical literature, the logical problem of evil is dead. You might run into it on the internet or, people who just don't really study philosophy, but amongst people who get paid to do this kind of thing, the logical problem of evil has been considered like just a closed case. It's done, right? Now, with that being said, we're not out of the woods yet, right? Because we still got to deal with the probability version of the problem of evil. So we're going to run through that real quick. I think we're making pretty good time here. So I think we'll be able to get to everything we wanted to get to. So I'll be quick, with the probability version of the problem of evil. Now, this one, this version is kind of like the scrappier little brother of the logical problem of evil, if you will, right? Because the thing is, with the logical problem of evil, it's like they set that high bar, right? The one that we just dealt with, the logical problem. They set this high bar of impossibility. That's kind of like in a criminal court where you have to prove that somebody's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a really high bar. But the probability version is a much lower bar. It's kind of like going to civil court where all you need is more evidence than not. So it's a much lower bar that the atheist sets for themselves. And actually, it makes it a more difficult argument to deal with. So let's read through it real quick. And we'll kind of show how we can give some responses. So number one, premise one, if God exists, then he is an omnipotent, omniscient, and all good. If God exists, then he is omnipotent, omniscient, and all good. Okay. Premise two, there's a tremendous amount of evil in the world, some of it not caused by humans and apparently gratuitous. That's a key word right there, apparently gratuitous. Premise three, it is unlikely that such an amount and kind of evil would exist if there is an omnipotent, omniscient, and all good being. Therefore, the conclusion, God probably does not exist. So again, in this version, they're not saying that it's impossible that God exists. They're just saying that, given the amount of evil in the world, God probably doesn't exist, and therefore it's not rational to affirm that he exists. That's what they're arguing here. So they set a much lower bar. Now, the key is going to be some of these words that are used, like in premise two, it says apparently gratuitous, which basically means evil that it seems to us to be just be over the top, as in just, beyond having any good reason for it. That's what they mean by apparently gratuitous evil or suffering. Premise three, you see that word unlikely. In premise four, you see that word probably. So again, that's speaking to this notion they've set a low bar. They're not saying it's impossible. They're just saying that it's unlikely to the degree that it's irrational to affirm that God exists. All right, so now with this argument, our objective is going to be different. We're going to look to provide counterpoints that undercut this notion that the existence of God is unlikely. We're going to raise the bar that demonstrating that it is likely that God exists. That's what we're going to do here. Now, I'll be pretty quick, but I want to just cover 3 points and make sure we get to everything. So, what are our 3 points here? Okay. All right. Point number one is pretty simple. Human beings are limited in terms of our knowledge of history, our knowledge of the future, our knowledge of how events in our lives or in the world in general will work together towards some, outcome of, this or that. We're basically in no position to claim that God doesn't have sufficient reason for the suffering that he allows. I mean, how can we possibly know that? We're just limited, finite beings, and we just don't have the capacity to make this definitive statement that God could not have sufficient reason for the evil and suffering that's allowed in the world. Now, real quick, I just want to, I don't have actually behind on my bookshelf back here, you can't see it, but I've got a book called The Colored Patriots. The Colored Patriots. It was written in 1852 by a man named William Cooper Nell. You actually get it online for free, but it's like 300 pages of William Cooper Nell just talking about different Black people, Africans in America, who fought in the Revolutionary War, right? Now, his purpose for that book was to highlight the personhood of African people in America, right? Now, in that book, it's very interesting, like towards the end, he talks about a group of Africans in Baltimore, okay? And some slave catchers that came to get him, to take him down south, and they were going to sell him into slavery, right? Sell him down the river. So they go to like this barn type of structure, and there's actually a shootout between the slave catchers and this group of Black people. And very fascinating. So what you see in the record is what these Black folks say is that, first of all, the slave catchers, they lose the shootout. They take a super L. I'm saying, I think one of them's ear got shot off or something like that. But they take these slave catchers take a super L in this shootout. But the African people, they came out unscathed, I'm saying unharmed. And what's fascinating is they actually quote one of the Africans who was there, said that God shook the bullets out of our clothes. It's fascinating. They attributed it to this miraculous event because they were, if you look at it, their account, they were in such close proximity. There's no reason why they shouldn't have gotten shot, but none of them got harmed. And so they attributed it to God. They said that God shook the bullets out of our clothes, right? Now, so, William Cooper Nell records this in this book in 1852, The Colored Patriots, again, as a testament to the personhood of the African. Now, this work of William Cooper Nell, it's out there at the same time that you see like Harriet Beecher Stowe's work, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was written to demonstrate the personhood of the enslaved person, Frederick Douglass's biography, that was written to, for the same purpose. A lot of Equiano, he was another abolitionist, African origin, who wrote his work for the same reason. All these different works are coming out to demonstrate the personhood of the enslaved person. Now, that notion has this ripple effect even out throughout the whole civil rights movement. That's why you see folks march around with those signs back in there, I am a man. They're attesting to their personhood, right? And so I said it to say that these individuals in Baltimore, there's no possible way that they could have known that when they took their stand against those slave catchers, that their story would be wrapped up in this broader picture of basically the Africans, communities attempt to demonstrate their personhood to the oppressive world that they were dealing with. There's no possible way that they would know in that moment when they were having this shootout that their story would have this big of an impact. Now I'm going to be real quick with this, but actually, interestingly enough, this notion of personhood is also tied to theology, because if you go way back to Tertullian, North African theologian early in Christianity, he wrote a work on the Trinity. And real quick, if you actually study the philosophical history of this idea of personhood, it traces back in some significant ways to Tertullian's work on the Trinity, because he's establishing that God is one God and three persons. And so even in legal tradition and philosophical tradition, they draw from Tertullian's work, and it kind of ripples throughout the Western world, contributing to our understanding of what personhood is. Okay, so this idea of personhood that the civil rights activists, abolitionists, and so forth are standing on to advocate for their freedom that notion was contributed to by the work of Tertullian centuries before, writing on the Trinity. Now, there's no way that Tertullian could have known that he's writing on the Trinity and his work will be used by philosophers to establish this notion of personhood, right? But you see all these aspects of history kind of interchanging with one another in ways that no human being can fathom. And so again, our knowledge of history, future, and how events work together is so limited that we just can't make this definitive statement that God can't have morally sufficient reason for the suffering and things that are going on, because human history and human experience is just too vast and beyond our capacity to do so. All right, real quick. So that's the first point. Secondly, in terms of background knowledge, just the issue of background knowledge. Okay, I'll be real quick with this one. So when it comes to this idea of background knowledge, if we were just looking at evil by itself, and just, like, man, you got this lockdown, you have COVID-19, got racism flaring up, people being killed, looting, all these kinds of things. If we were just looking at the evil in the world, I mean, shoot, we got like murder hornets now. It's crazy out here, right? If that's all we were focusing on, then somebody might be like, you know what? Maybe there is no God, right? Maybe just looking at evil, maybe there is a problem here if we only took that into account. But here's the thing: probability is, in terms of what's likely or what's unlikely, is always based upon background knowledge. You know what I'm saying? If I told you that I was walking on the moon yesterday, you might be like, that's probably not true. But if you see me with a NASA uniform and a name tag, and then you look on the news and you see me up there, saying that I walked on the moon yesterday, now you've got some more facts in play by which you can say, well, you know what? Initially, I thought he was just playing around, but unless either he's the greatest troll of all time or he really walked on the moon yesterday, right? So likewise, that's how probability works. So if we're just looking at evil, you might say, oh, well, maybe God doesn't exist. But if you add on other facts, right, then you'll say, well, you know what? In light of all the facts available to us, we can say it's not unlikely that God exists. So facts would be different arguments for God's existence, like the moral argument for God's existence, cosmological arguments for God's existence, the fine-tuning argument for God's existence. I just gave you the argument for God's existence from evil itself. We can talk about the resurrection argument. The evidence that we have for the resurrection, the testimony of scripture, and even personal experience. You can bring all those things into account. And when you take them all together, and you're not just looking at evil, but you're looking at the full set of the data, you can say, well, you know what? Maybe initially, just based on evil alone, it seemed like God isn't likely that he exists. But taken all together, we can say, no, God does likely exist, given the full weight and full range of the evidence. Okay, so that's what we're talking about with background now. Christian doctrine, I'll just put it this way, just to kind of speed it up a little bit. Christian doctrine has packaged within it certain elements that serve as a buffer against or shield against the problem of evil. To put it that way. So, for example, what is the purpose of life? All right. Contrary to what Joel Osteen says, purpose of life is not happiness, right? It's not just about your best life now, right? The purpose of life is knowing God. Matthew chapter 23, verse 37. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. That's the number one commandment. John chapter 17, verse 3. This is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ who you sent. So the measuring stick for how you evaluate life or the quality of life is not happiness, it's your knowledge of God. That's the measuring stick for how we evaluate life. Now, can God achieve knowledge of him through suffering? Well, of course he can. I can look at my own life. I mean, I just told you earlier how my wife and I, we suffered that miscarriage. And through that experience, I came to know more about God. I came to know more about him. So at least in principle, we know that suffering, it's like the scripture says, count it all joy when you fall into various trials and tribulations, because it brings you to a place of maturity, essentially, right? We know that suffering can work for our good, right? So there's that. Also, secondly, sin. Man is in rebellion against God. Bottom line, Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so we know why moral evil exists. I mean, that's not unlikely on the biblical worldview, because man is sinful and we out here sinning. And not just moral evil, but also I think that accounts for natural evil, because if you understand that, the Imago Dei includes this component of us collectively, we're supposed to be stewarding the earth in a way that represents God. Well, obviously, if we're out of step with that, then we've opened the door for brokenness in the world, including the natural evil that we see. And so basically, our sin even accounts for natural evil in the world. Maybe we can come back to that. Number 3, eternity. The fact of the matter is, we can't just look at this life, right? It's not like we got this one life and that's it. People were saying YOLO, back in the day. I know it's old, but you got one life to live, kind of a thing, right? You only live once. That's not the case. We got eternity to look to. It's like 2 Corinthians 4:17 says, for our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs, the things, the suffering that we're dealing with. It far outweighs all the suffering, right? So, we got eternity for which God can bring about well-being for his people. And then lastly, God is an incomparable good, right? God is an incomparable good. There's no evil that you can experience this life that can counterbalance the goodness of God that you'll experience for eternity. God is an incomparable good. No evil or no suffering can possibly measure up to having a relationship with him for eternity. And that's why 2 Corinthians 4:18 can say, we look not at the things that are seen, but the things that are not seen. The things that are seen are temporary. The things that are seen are eternal. By definition, things that are temporary, they only last for a certain time. Eternity is infinite. So how can something that's temporal outweigh something that's infinite? Just by definition, we can see that's not the case. So all these problems kind of serve to offset this notion that it's unlikely that God exists. The doctrines of Christianity itself, along with those other pieces, it's almost like football equipment. Football equipment basically absorbs the impact, so injuries don't occur. That's kind of how those doctrines and those points that I gave kind of work. They absorb the impact of the problem of evil, such that it's not that you don't feel the impact, it's just that it doesn't injure you or knock you out of the game. Okay. Now I know I got to move quickly because I want to make sure that I'm staying on time. I'm coming in hot, so I got a couple more joints to go. But for those reasons,
Brother Adam, before you transition, let's say 5 more minutes, and then we have plenty of time for Q&A. We're at 11:35 now. Let's say 5 more minutes, and then we'll have a good amount of Q&A to get questions from the audience and make sure they're clear on everything that's presented.
Okay, great. Okay, good. So actually, what I'm going to do is I guess maybe we can come back to like the Hebrew Israelite part, and maybe we can tackle that in the Q&A. And I'll make sure I deal with the what I think is probably the most critical piece. I do want to say, again, like I said, all worldviews are created equal. So maybe we can get into that during the Q&A in terms of how the Hebrew Israelites, Muslims, and Moors, how they fail in terms of addressing this issue. But yeah, so let's talk about the emotional problem of evil. What kind of responses can we give to that? First and foremost, I think that it's important that we understand that the problem of evil is in some sense relational, right? When you think about how God goes about dealing with the problem of evil, like think about the book of Job, for example. I'm saying when he shows up at the end of the book of Job, he doesn't just send somebody with some information to Job and then squash it like that. No, Job has a personal encounter with God, right? Also in the book of Revelation, it talks about how God will wipe the tears from our eyes, right? There's this personal encounter. It's a relational encounter with God that ultimately is a resolution. And as his representatives here on the earth, that's how we want to approach. We want to be incarnational, if you will, in terms of how we engage the problem of evil. So if you're dealing with somebody who's dealing with the problem of evil and suffering, the first thing you want to do is listen. We're instructed by scripture we're instructed by scripture to be quick to listen and slow to speak. You don't want to just dive in. I had a situation, matter of fact, like I talked about the miscarriage. I had a friend of the family who came up to me, and in response to it, he said, "Man, you know what? One of these days you're gonna look back on this and realize this is the best thing that could have ever happened to you." And I'm telling you, like, I mean, it was literally the dumbest thing anybody could possibly say. I mean, it took all the Holy Ghost in me to keep from cussing that man out. I'm in the midst of dealing with this problem of evil, this miscarriage, and that was just the wrong thing to say. Sometimes you don't have to say anything. Sometimes you don't have to say anything. Sometimes just being there for people is enough. So we need to make sure that we're listening, hearing people out. And they may want to deal with the intellectual side, they may not. But usually what I'll do is I'll ask people. If they ask, well, why would God allow this? I would say, I can address that question, but before I do, I want to make sure, is that really where you want to go in the conversation? And they might not. They might have just been asking rhetorically, and then the best thing I can do is kind of be with them in that moment and just kind of listen. Second, lament. This kind of gets into something that we talked about during that Q&A earlier. But I think lamenting is probably, in my opinion, I think it's just like a lost aspect of the biblical worldview. I'm saying we don't understand the power of lament, like really bearing witness. And as it says in Romans chapter 12, verse 15, rejoicing with those who rejoice, mourning with those who mourn. Lamenting is a witness to the character of God. We can come alongside people, and really be with them in moments of distress, whether they're saved or unsaved. That's a witness to the character of God. Thirdly, labor. And I mean that two different ways. The Bible talks about Galatians 6:2, that we're to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Bear one of those burdens. We're talking about an action word. We're talking about action words right there. We can't be distant in terms of how we engage evil and suffering in other people's lives, right? Jesus doesn't operate that way. So in the midst of our sin and depravity and brokenness, Jesus doesn't stand afar off. He enters into human history and endures suffering himself on the cross, right? He gets his hands dirty in the brokenness of mankind and the suffering of mankind, right? And we ought to be the same way. We ought to have the same heart. So, sometimes you got to get your hands dirty and really get in there and bear one another's burdens. So that might be something as simple as maybe somebody's lost a family member, bringing them a plate by the house, bringing them some food or something like that. Or maybe somebody's grappling with some sort of mental health issue, but they don't have transportation, to get to that appointment with their pastor or a mental health worker. So you give them a ride or something like that. Those are ways that we can bear one of those burdens and actually labor towards the well-being of somebody else. Also, even, you mentioned with Surge, I mean, you're dealing with creating a justice aspect of your ministry, JC I'm talking to, and you guys are gonna be doing some things in the community. That's labor too, because in Matthew 5:16, it says, in the same way, let your light shine before others that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. When we get our hands dirty in the brokenness of the world and we're, really exemplifying justice in the public square, that's an element that says, it's a signpost where people can say, man, there's all this evil going around, but wait a minute, there's this signpost, there's this lighthouse pointing me towards something greater. And ultimately, we want to be looking to Christ. We want to be looking to Christ. Like I said, when it comes to apologetics, the difference between us doing apologetics and just some sort of starchy philosophy is that we're not just trying to introduce people to a set of ideas, or we're not just trying to get you to a place, i.e. heaven. We're bringing you to a person, the person of Jesus Christ. I'm saying that's the centerpiece of what we're about, right? We're bringing you to a person, a personal relationship with Jesus Christ for eternity, right? It's like what it says in 1 John 1:3, what we have seen and heard, we also declare to you, so that you may have fellowship along with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and with the Son, Jesus Christ. So, I'm gonna kind of close out by saying that, I'm persuaded that when it is all said and done, with all the philosophical and theological arguments we can provide, you don't have a complete answer to the problem of evil if you don't have Jesus, okay? You don't have an answer to the problem of evil if you don't have Jesus. Jesus, who's able to give you that peace that passes all understanding, that Holy Spirit kind of peace. Jesus said to the disciples, my peace I give unto you, not as the world give it. My peace I give unto you, right? If you don't have Jesus in the picture, then I'm convinced you can do all theologizing and philosophizing in the world. You still don't have that answer to the problem of evil unless you have Christ. And I want to leave with that.
Excellent, brother. Thank you so much for pointing us to the cross and the person of Jesus Christ. I think that's absolutely important as we're doing apologetics, that we're tying it into the gospel and presenting Christ to people. Let's go ahead into our Q&A time here. And before we do, real quick, just wanna plug our brother Adam again. If you appreciated just the content that he brought to the table, which was excellent. We've been getting just a lot of great comments in the Facebook live chat and things like that. And so you did an excellent job, brother, of just breaking it down. These are some very tough and complex concepts, but I think you made it very accessible and understandable for everyday believers. So you did an excellent job. So just want to plug our brother Adam. He has the Tru-ID podcast, so you can check him out there, Apple Podcasts, or you can go on his YouTube page, and he has Tru-ID YouTube page as well. You can like and subscribe there and check out all of his great content. He actually has a whole lesson on God versus the Wu-Tang Clan, where he deals with those different worldviews and stuff that he didn't have much time to get to. Even though that someone did ask that in the question, so we're going to give you a little bit of time to deal with that. But yeah, so check him out there, and then also for the Surge Evangelism Ministry, if you want to be a part of what we're doing, if you want to join the ministry, or if you got more questions about what we're doing, email me jcjones@epiphanyfellowship.org. So let's go ahead and jump into these questions. We got some questions already. Please send in your questions. We got about 15 minutes, everyone, for questions. So go ahead and type your questions into the chat. So brother, you touched on this briefly towards the end, but I think this is very important. And we have one of our nurses here at Epiphany asked this, and we have a lot of nurses, doctors, healthcare workers, and things like that. And here's what she says. She says, in light of her healthcare profession, she deals with the emotional problem of evil and suffering a lot. And so people asking, why did God allow this, this suffering to my loved one and all of that? And she says, a lot of times in the healthcare, they're kind of trained to deal with the grief side of it. So show empathy and things like that. Her question is, what are some good scriptures or reasoning to point to us pointing people to God or the gospel of Jesus Christ without being insensitive, just some reasonings behind doing that? Or do we just continue to ignore the question, just address the grief with empathy and just pray for that person? You touched on it briefly, but can you elaborate a little bit on, when is the right time? You talked about diagnosis and prescription. When is the right time, and how would you go about navigating that?
Sure. So I understand it, because I'm actually a social worker by trade. I'm a social worker, and I currently work in a hospital myself. So I totally get that question. Now, the way I look at it is there are some things that are just true about the world, right? And there are times when even in the literature, if you look at there's a bunch of mental health literature on spirituality, the interaction between spirituality and mental health, right? And they'll talk about, I'm thinking about what's called strengths perspective, particularly with strengths perspective is this notion that as you're treating people, you want to assess what strengths they have that they bring to the table that will help them to navigate whatever it is that they're getting treatment for. Everybody has certain strengths. And among the types of things that people note as far as the strengths that somebody might have is maybe some sort of spiritual base. If you have somebody who's going to church, if you will, and tied into Christ, then they're going to be better able to navigate through, say, depression or despair better than somebody who believes that life has no meaning, and so on and so forth. So I said that to say that even in the literature, this notion of spirituality having being a type of strength that somebody can tap into, then provides an open door, for somebody like myself, and I think the questioner, to engage with the person that we're dealing with in regard to spirituality. Now, you have to be careful, depending on what context you're in. You want to kind of look at your ethics board and whatever ethics constraints that you're dealing with in your setting. But I do it all the time, man. I mean, like once somebody tells me that they're a Christian, they're going to church, then I talk to them along those lines, right? Or if they're not a Christian, and to say that, maybe they're a Muslim or something like that, then I'm going to point them to that general revelation that I talked about earlier. I'm going to point them to the idea that whether you're Muslim or whatever, we can all affirm that life has value, that human beings have value. And I might work from some of those truths. So I guess to maybe make it more specific, when I'm dealing with non-Christians, I'm always going to be cognizant of certain aspects of general revelation that are going to intersect with a person, whatever their worldview may be. There's a purpose to life. We all have value, and so on and so forth. And sometimes I am able to sow some seeds, just enough to kind of maybe, God can water it later on down the road. But I would encourage them to just kind of really look through the scriptures and see what is it, think about like Romans chapter 1-3. What are some things that are common in the human experience that God has revealed to all people, and how can they harness that in dealing with the people that they're addressing?
Excellent, brother. I think that's very helpful for
Mm-hmm.
our people that are in these various spaces. Next question that we have is, what can be said to how it appears that different groups suffer more than others? So some refer to the judgment and punishment of Cain in the Bible, for example. Is there a certain thing as a marked people or a cursed people? So how do you respond to that, where it seems like, I'm imagining that this person is talking about African Americans, seems like we suffer more. How do you engage people and respond to that?
That's a very good question. Very good question. To be honest, I think it's always difficult to say what group is suffering more and when. I mean, I guess it's a very contextual question. Like right now, you can say that people of African descent in the Western world maybe are suffering more than white people. Let's say if they want to put it that way. That could be the case. Let's just say that is the case. Why that's the case, we can't always necessarily say. It's like when Jesus and his disciples came upon the blind man and they were like, yo, who sinned, that this man is made blind? And God was like, Jesus said, nobody sinned, but, he was born this way that, the Father in heaven will be glorified, right? Ultimately, we know that God is going to bring things about in the world such that it's ultimately glorifying to him. And I believe that, because he is love, is, in the ultimate scheme of things, it'll be to the well-being of his creation, those who have not rejected him and so forth. So, even though in the immediate, we may not be able to see, why one group is suffering more than another, that's where you look past the suffering itself and say, well, what can I know about the character of God? Was it Abraham in Genesis who asked the question, will the judge of all things not do right? I'm saying there's something I can know about the character of God that helps me to navigate what I don't know about the things that are going on specifically in the world. So we don't always know why one group is suffering more than another. I mean, at various different times in history, some groups are on top, some groups aren't. We're just not in a position to say in every instance why that is. But we do know that even then we can trust in the character of God, and that ultimately it will all equalize towards something that glorifies him.
Yeah, excellent, brother. Another question that we have is, so someone actually asks, how do you, just in practical ways, or how could we in practical ways engage Hebrew Israelites and those who are of the Kemetic persuasion specifically? So those two groups, and I know we didn't have time to get into the slides, but if you want to talk about some of that at this point, brother, maybe how the worldviews kind of compare, but how would you, and then also give them some practical tips. How would you engage a person that's of the Israelite or the Kemetic persuasion, if in general, but then also if there's sisters, like women that are in that as well? So yeah, how would you practically engage them?
Well, I mean, for one thing, I want to go back to what I was saying about we don't want to paint ourselves in a corner. It's so easy when somebody lobs an objection at us, we want to just dive in and give a response. But we have to remember that every worldview has to deal with the problem of evil. Every worldview has to give an account for how their worldview can basically address there being evil and suffering in the world. And like I said earlier, all worldviews are not created equal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give the biblical account, like the things I just ran through, as to how the Christian worldview can account for the problem of evil. And then I'm going to put it back on them and say, okay, now that I've given you, give you my version or my perspective, explain to me how the Hebrew Israelite account or the Muslim or whatever can do that. Now, real quickly, I do want to point people to my podcast, or you can go to my YouTube page where I do have this episode called, God versus the Wu-Tang Clan, where I give an hour-long version of what I'm about to say, but I'll just give you the snippet version right now. Ultimately, the problem of evil revolves around morality, right? And all worldviews can't provide a solid foundation for morality. Now, when you think about Muslims, Hebrew Israelites, for the most part, Moors, they're basically Unitarian. They believe that there's one God, or God is one in a sense. Versus Christians, we believe that the proper teaching of Scripture is that God is a Trinitarian being. He's one God who exists as three persons. One God, three persons. Versus the Unitarian, we just have that one God, one person, if you will. Now, here's the thing. This is a snippet version. There's this concept in philosophy called the greatest conceivable being. The notion is that God has to be the greatest conceivable being. If you can think of a being that's higher than God, then or greater than God, then that would be God. So God has to be the greatest conceivable being. Now, to be the greatest conceivable being, you'd have to be morally great, right? You'd have to be the greatest moral being. If you have one person, let's say you go to a lawyer, one of them has no integrity, the other one does. Which lawyer are you going to go with? you're going to go with the one who has integrity, right? Now, as far as being the greatest morally, you're going to intersect with this notion of love, in terms of what it means to be all loving. Now, here's what I'm going to argue to kind of give it a snippet version. I'm going to argue that the Trinitarian conception of God in Christianity provides a better account of God being all loving than the Unitarian concept of God. The reason is, if God is just one and just one person and that's it, then from eternity past, he could not have been all loving because there was nobody else to love. He may have been self-loving, but that aspect of giving love to someone else, he would not have been able to practice that until after he created somebody else. That means that on a Unitarian concept that the Hebrew Israelites, Moors, Muslims hold to, God cannot exemplify everything that love means without something else existing. Versus the Trinitarian concept, you got one God, three persons with love. You got self-love there, and then love amongst the persons of the Trinity. So you have this more dynamic reflection of love in terms of self-love and then outward love from eternity past on Christianity. And so the Christian God affords this bigger picture of what love is like than the Unitarian concept of God. Therefore, the Christian God, the Trinitarian perspective, is going to give you a greater possible, this greatest conceivable being. Now, if something is less than the greatest, then it can't be God. That means the Unitarian concept of God can't be possibly God because it's lesser than, in terms of love and more and that moral dynamic, than the Trinitarian version of God. So anytime you have these Hebrew Israelites coming, or Muslims or Moors or whatever, my thing is they're going to be building their moral framework on the God that is by definition not the greatest possible being, because he can't be as all loving as the Trinitarian version, because it didn't have that outward love from eternity past. And it depends on the existence of other beings to exemplify that outward love. So it can't be the greatest possible being. Therefore, that God doesn't exist, the Unitarian God. And then also, if they're not all loving, they're building on a framework that is on lesser footing, morally speaking, than the Trinitarian version. And then, I would just refer people to my podcast to check out what I deal with Kemetics. Because actually, for Kemetics, it's even worse. I mean, I can say in 30 seconds, the Kemetic Spiritualists, they believe that everything is God. Now, if everything is God, and evil exists, that means it exists, then evil is a part of God itself, right? That means you have a morally imperfect being off top. And how can you build a moral framework on a being that's morally imperfect? You know what I'm saying? I mean, for the Kemetics, they would have to concede that God is both, if everything is God, God is the slave, and he's also the slave master beating the slave. So you get and run into all these moral contradictions. So on that view, Kemeticism really falls apart. So I would just refer people back to my podcast to hear a longer version of that.
Okay. Great. Thank you, brother. That was a good snippet. And again, like he said to everyone, he unpacks that more in depth. That's that God versus Wu-Tang Clan. That's an excellent lesson. And he has so much other content. Tru-ID Apologetics podcast. That's TRU-ID Apologetics podcast, where you can get more content from Adam Coleman. Check him out there. Subscribe.
I'm sorry, on the website, there's no dash. It's just TRUID.
Okay.
Podcast.com. Yeah.
Thank you for that, brother. Thank you for that. And so please check him out there. YouTube channel, podcast, website. Adam, what are some other ways that people can connect with you if they have questions or things like that? Are there other ways people can connect with you?
Oh, sure. Definitely, man. Definitely want to, I'm always on Facebook, so you can definitely catch me there, Adam Coleman. I think I'm the real Adam Coleman on there. You can definitely catch me at TRUID, the number 7 at Gmail, if people have questions. And also Tru-ID Apologetics.com. That's my website as well. So people can check me out through those. Twitter, I think twitter.com/ScottLane7. Scott Lane was my alias when I was doing gospel rap. So definitely you want to check me out there as well.
Okay. All right. Well, Adam, thank you again for your time. Thank you for joining us. And then thank you all for joining us. Hopefully this was helpful. And again, we're wanting to train you all on urban apologetics, making some of these things understandable and accessible so that as you go out and you tie evangelism to your apologetics, where you're trying to tell people about Jesus and the gospel, they're going to have some of these questions. This is a very common question, the problem of evil and suffering. He did an excellent job of unpacking it and giving you some answers. So you want to answer people's questions as you're building relationship with them, getting to know them, and seeking to tell them about Jesus Christ. And so always tie in your apologetics with your evangelism. And as he did at the end, he pointed us to the person of Jesus Christ in the gospel. And that's what you want to do as you're unpacking the answers to their questions and dealing with the objections. So that's all the time we got. We got more questions coming in, man.
Sorry about that, man. Sorry.
People just really appreciated it, man. So thank you again, brother Adam. And please, everyone, if you got more questions, hit them up at the sites that we've already shared for him, and then also email address and things like that. So that's all the time that we have. Hope you all enjoy your day.